Okay, so rebonjour. We are now having the Be Magic carousel, and it will be less spectacular than it sounds, but the term carousel was a term that we always used within Be Magic to present each other our respective research lines and developments, publications, and so forth. So I thought, why not reuse the name carousel or merry-go-round if you want, to present to you today the research that we have been doing. So when I opened the conference this morning, I said that there were 5 universities and 1 school of arts. That was true. However, you will now see that we have 8 research groups, because some universities had 2 research groups joining in to the project, like the University of Antwerp. I'll begin with the University of Antwerp with my own research group, Visual Poetics, of which I'm the director. Visual Poetics is a research group at the University of Antwerp, and the impetus for creating the group came from the observation of intermedial commonalities between theater and film. So team members study contemporary art, performance, theater, dance, installation art, and cinema. But over the years, there has been also a strong emphasis on historiography, manifesting itself in an increasing attention towards media archaeology, reenactment, and intellectual history. And this is, of course, also where Be Magic enters or comes into the limelight. Our Be Magic team consists of 3 postdoc researchers, Leen Engelen, Evelien Jonckheere, and Sabine Lenk, and 2 science communicators, Julie de Smet and Elisa Segers, who you know by now, I think. I function as spokesperson and coordinator of Be Magic, and this means that the Antwerp team, the whole team, took on a large part of the organization of the project. We also intensely, with the help of Elisa and Julie, invested in science communication. We've built a strong network of societal stakeholders, cultural heritage organizations, periodicals, private collectors, museums, curators, national press, related projects, you will see that in a minute also, and artists. And we also organized several visibility campaigns, and I just want to take the occasion to briefly highlight 2 exhibitions that we mounted in Ghent, the city of Ghent in Belgium, in collaboration with magicians and illusionists. Prestidigitateurs, I like the word in French, illusionists. One was on light. It was in the context of the Light Festival. That's an annual festival in Ghent with very large-scale events happening outside. And the other one was on phantasmagoria and ghosts. We all know that at the end of since the end of the 18th century, scientists used optical instruments to dissect and to demonstrate the properties of light and or to connect to the otherworldly. What we did is we strived to revive this tradition, this phantasmagorical tradition, this match between the world of science and the world of magic, by bringing into dialogue centuries-old light and projection techniques with the present. So what we did is we used original lanterns, original material, slides, optical instruments. We reused them on scene, and we also made a kind of exhibition with this material. I'm telling you this because you can find the afterlife of these events on the Be Magic website. There's also a short documentary clip that you can see there. Voilà. My own research, very briefly, and here we step into the merry-go-round, I think, revolves around performing science. I focused, for an example, on lantern shows sparked by the discovery during the mid-19th century of prehistoric evidence, fossils, bones, and the subsequent establishment of geology and paleontology as new academic disciplines in the mid-19th century. At that time, empirical science presented the contemporary with overwhelming evidence that mankind has been preceded not by just 1 week of God's primal creative act, but by an immensely lengthy and eventful past, deep time, right? And I argue that the magic lantern played a very crucial part in opening up the thought-provoking space of deep time. The repertoire of those who designed the scenes brought into conjunction natural history with aesthetic iconography and biblical tradition. A case in point is a magnificent slide series taken from the book La Terre avant le déluge, a book published in 1863 by Louis Figuier, the French popularizer of science. And the scenes that you see here were initially drawn by Édouard Rioux. Édouard Rioux was a student of Gustave Doré, one of the most prolific and successful illustrators of the 19th century, who would reuse these scenes, Rioux did, reuse these scenes in the very same year, 1863, for Jules Verne's soon-to-be legendary Journey to the Center of the Earth. I published a chapter on this in the first Be Magic book. I'll tell you more about the Be Magic book, the first two Be Magic books this afternoon. Another interest of mine is the ways in which science interact with the obscure and the otherworldly. I, for an example, researched the tradition of metempsychosis together with Evelien. I briefly mentioned this because it gives me the occasion to answer your question, Gabriella. So metempsychosis was a very different tradition if you compare it to the British metempsychosis used by Pepper and with which he then toured apparently through Australia, because there was no comical dimension to it. So on the continent, technically spoken, they used a bust of a female, of a woman, and projected with a lantern a moving image on the face. And the face then transformed from a woman's face into a skull, into flowers, back again into a skull, and then ended with a woman's face, and ending the whole scene with the live presence of the actress coming on stage, entering the audience. So the difference was, in a nutshell, that this attraction on the fairground connected much more to the whole idea of reincarnation and the obscure and the whole movement around Alan Kardec, for an example, in France and also in Belgium, than it did in England, where it was staged also as a kind of ironical, comical effect. So the idea of Pygmalion was very central to this metempsychosis attraction. But I'm not going to speak too long about this. I don't want to take up too much space. So I'm going to ask Leen Engelen and Sabine Lenk to join me here and talk about what they have been doing.
Yeah, okay. As you know, I'm not Evelien Jonckheere. She couldn't be here this afternoon, but I will briefly say a few words about all the research that she has done. Should you have any questions about that, you can ask her tomorrow. She has focused on what she calls les dérives de la lanterne, so the derivatives of the lantern. This means that she has moved beyond the traditional dispositif of the lantern, and she looks at practices that move away from the projection of images on glass slides. She looks at alternative practices that are aimed at achieving illusions and aesthetic effects that are often spiritually charged. Like you can see from the examples here on the slide, she worked on metempsychosis together with Kurt. She worked also on serpentine dances. Luminous fountains are one of her favorite subjects as well. She worked on shadow theater and recently on color organs. These practices have in common that they materialize new scientific insights in the field of electromagnetism, psychology, physiology, etc., and that they also result in a new aesthetic or a somewhat quirky aesthetic sometimes that is often attuned to alternative forms of spirituality. So that is also one of her focal points. I think that sums it up. She has also worked part-time as an administrator, coordinator on the project. So she was also involved in the organization of all these wonderful events Kurt already mentioned. But so if you want to learn more about that, you can ask Evelien tomorrow.
So, hello everybody. I work for 2 universities, and this is my first university I will present. What do I do for University of Antwerp? Okay, you see, it's a lot of religion. For me, the challenge was how do the Catholics use the lantern? And there is a second project. This is this one here. Thanks to Margo, we have this wonderful GIS map. I did together with Evelien a mapping and a scanning project. For me, these different slides stand for different facets of the Catholic or the religious lantern. What you see here, this is the Catholic lantern or religious lantern as a narrator of exciting stories. Here you see, this is the lantern as a tool for propaganda, because you see all these men turning away from church. There's only the little one who is still in contact with the priest. What you see here, this cross on top of the mountain, this is, for me, the lantern as an illuminator of faith. Next to it is Christ and San Francisco's. I don't know who painted it, but it's art. So the lantern is a teacher of taste, aesthetics, and enjoyment of arts. Here you see these are Christian symbolics, they are angels, and this means for me the lantern as a disseminator of knowledge about Christian rules and icons and symbolics. And the last one, this is Christ with religious saying. This is for me the lantern as an instructor of catechism in school and in church. This part here shows what we did before, which I did with Nelleke before we started the Be Magic. It was mapping where the collections are, because you can't do a study on your archival objects like slides if you don't know where they are. When Evelien joined us, we continued and we found a lot more, and you will know more about it if you come to the panel 6 tomorrow in the afternoon. Then we tell more about what we did. In any case, mapping where the collections are, getting access, photographing slides, scanning some slides. This is the important part, because then you can have it at home and you can go through the pictures again and again and study them. So for us, this was a very important point. Without our efforts on this part, we couldn't have done the project. Thanks.
Next one up is also... Oh, sorry, Leen, ik ben u vergeten om te gaan spreken.
Sorry. No problem, no problem. So just a few words still about my own research. I joined the project a little under 2 years ago. My first idea was to work on the work of Eugène Frey. Eugène Frey is a Belgian painter. He's not very famous in Belgium. I think he left Belgium as soon as he could walk, but he was born here. He tried being a painter, but then around 1900, a little before, he became interested in the shadow theater, and he operated his own shadow theater in Paris, the Boîte à Musique. So that's his pre-trajectory to begin the real work. Right after the turn of the century, he started developing a lantern infrastructure, or a huge lantern, you could call it. You have a picture over there. It's a machine combining up to 12 different lanterns, and he used it to project moving images and not film, so lantern moving images and dissolving views on the backdrop of opera and other stage performances. So he worked for the music hall and for the opera, and he spent most of his career in the Opera of Monte Carlo. Very fancy and mundane that was, but he got a lot of opportunities there to work on really big productions, and those productions also toured. So I'm studying at the moment, together with a musicologist, the work he did for La Damnation de Faust by Berlioz, which is a very special musical piece with a very special scenography as well. It had already had many performances before Frey was taken on board, and we are looking at how, which stage tricks that were previously done without projections are now being done with the help of projections. So using this very complicated projection machine. The technique was coined by Eugène Frey, the décor lumineux. So that's how he called it. It has been forgotten for a long time, or almost forgotten, maybe not for you, but for most, most other people. But there was an exhibition on his work 2 years ago in the museum in Monte Carlo, so now he is a little more known already. So that's the first project, it's ongoing research. A second project I've been working on is actually is following from my previous research on the panoramic paintings. And I started looking at the role that the lantern played and how that projections in the round, like 360 projections, were being introduced in lantern practice on the one hand and in the panorama business on the other hand. Because around 1900, the panorama was a bit on its return. It was over the height of its popularity, and they were trying to find ways to consolidate the success or to keep the business running. And so there were many experiments with projected images instead of painted images. For example, by Charles Chase in the United States or by the Lumière brothers in France. I also worked on a third project, which is about the Kaiser panorama, but I shall be talking about that later.
Thanks. Urban History. Research Center for Urban History, also University of Antwerp. I'll let you introduce the crew. Oh.
Good afternoon. Oh, sorry. So it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you the Center for Urban History team. Of course, Margo Buelens-Terryn, our PhD students. And then we have had 2 postdocs in our project, Evelien Jonckheere and Kristof Loockx, who are actually, for the moment, out of the project. But it testifies for their enthusiasm and their still ongoing commitment for the EOS B-Magic consortium, that they're here and that they're willing to present what they did within the consortium. Actually, we should mention more people. Eleonora Paclon, for instance, she worked for 1 year as a technical assistant within the project. There is Eleonora, thank you. And we also had job students, Eline Keulemans and Els Mine. And Margo and I, we also supervised a Bachelor 3 seminar within the history educational program. And so we are also very grateful for all the students that worked within the margins of the B-Magic project. So a good colleague of mine, a friend, also recently described the field of what is sometimes called the new cinema history in slightly derogatory fashion, being concerned, so he said, with everything but the picture. And this made me a bit slightly ill at ease because actually our role within the EOS consortium has also been characterized by looking at everything but the picture. So mainly looking at the infrastructure around lantern slides and looking at the context and the historical backdrops around the kind of visual or discursive analysis that you guys are doing with all these wonderful lantern slides. So what did we do within the consortium? We were mainly concerned by the who, so looking at the social background of who were those people that were using lanterns and that were using lantern slides. So speakers, but also the organizations, who were the societies, the clubs that were organizing these lantern performances. Where were they doing this? And the where was really the spatial question, which we will be dealing with in a moment. So both from a macro and a micro perspective, the what, so what were the themes? And there, I think we also touched upon lantern slides. And then for whom and how, so who were the audiences? And we tried to look at this for Belgium in a kind of diachronic perspective from the end of the 19th century until the first decades of the 20th century. What we have tried to do is to look at illustrated lantern performances as part of a rapidly modernizing urban landscape of creative and cultural businesses, or cultural industries, as they are sometimes called in literature. So a cultural business or a cultural industry is a kind, we saw as a kind of specialized urban circuit next to, overlapping with early cinema, theater, café chantants, dance rooms, auditoria for lecturing. So it's part of that kind of evolving infrastructure of the modernizing city. It's a kind of circuit that deals with specialized knowledge and talent, spatial clustering. So it's consumer and audience oriented in subject, taste, show, refinement, and it's also a specific business, as we saw, for instance, in the wonderful lecture of Professor Jolly, that has to do with low fixed costs, but also low commercial profits. These were typical the kind of traveling performance that could be hired by a lot of clubs, societies, organizations, you name it. And so looking at these cultural industries, these illustrated lantern performances, we have tried to bring in a kind of digital and spatial infused type of analysis within visual media studies or performance theater histories, what have you. So a data-driven research, Margo is going to tell you about that research using GIS. Jason is going to tell you more about GIS and social network analysis.
So the backbone of this big data-driven research is an extensive Excel database, which I constructed by using Belgica Press. Belgica Press is the digitized newspaper archive of the Royal Library of Belgium. And first of all, I selected a corpus of newspapers, which made it possible to make a comparison between Antwerp and Brussels, so two important cities at the time in Belgium. And yeah, let's be honest, there are still important cities in Belgium at this time. But also newspapers that compared Dutch and French language, but also the three major pillars of the time in Belgium. So there were socialists, the Catholics, and the liberals. And secondly, by using some search terms such as projection, lumineuse, and lichtbeelden, it became also possible to select and find newspaper articles that announced or reviewed the use of the projection lantern in the lecture circuit in Antwerp and Brussels. And thirdly, the information I found in these newspapers I processed in an Excel database, which is now in size around 9,000 rows and 100 columns. And this database contains now 3 different sample periods, one around 1900, the First World War, and one around the 1920s. And I deliberately chose to also include the First World War because it's often research in isolation. I think it is important to see an evolution through time, but also continuations both in peacetime, in wartime, and through time. This database also contains now around 8,000 references to lantern lectures, but some of these lectures were announced more than once, so are in my database more than once. So it was also important to find a manner to identify unique, of what I call unique lantern lectures, and we found around 6,000 of them. And I also identified in my database around 1,800 different speakers, 800 different organizations, 666 different locations where these lectures took place, but also the themes discussed in these lectures could be divided in 5 major categories, but also 82 different subcategories. So my database is, I think, very extensive, which made it also possible to find more broader and structural patterns of this Antwerp and Brussels lecture circuit in my 3 time frames. And by this database, it became also possible to find interesting case studies, both for me as for colleagues of the BMagic Consortium. And we got also some insight in the more sociocultural situation of Belgium at that time. And, sorry. One of my major findings is, for example, the readjustment of the breakthrough of the lantern in the lecture circuit in Antwerp and Brussels to the turn of the century with a high day until the 1920s and the early 1930s. And this was related to the democratization in politics, but also culture, religion, and economics, which made it more urgent to reach out to large groups of society. And as we all know, the Project Lantern was an ideal medium to do that. And the locations found in my database made it also possible to actually map the lecture circuit in Antwerp and Brussels through GIS, and Jas will tell more about that.
Okay, thank you. So, second part of our analysis strategy was using space and geographical information systems to shed new light on the use and the locations, in this case, of the Magic Lantern in 2 case study cities, in Brussels and in Antwerp. Although I like geographic information systems, as you know, a lot, a very large lot, they also take a lot of time that you have to invest before something runs out. So the first 2 years that I was attached to this project, I was mainly working on setting up the basic GIS infrastructures for those 2 cities. We could make use of synergies with our own historical Antwerp project, but also Brussels historical GIS. But we had to process, well, a few address books to gather thousands and thousands and thousands of locations where people lived, and attached to the names of these persons, also their professions, to get a background to which we could plot the Magic Lantern performances and the locations, and have an idea of the socio-economic circumstances they were given in. So that's what we did at first, set up these infrastructures. Then we plotted almost all of the locations that Margo found on top of these infrastructures. And then we also integrated a lot of other sources, for instance, cinema data or maps on public transport, to also overlay them with this locational data. In a second stage, when the real fun started and I just had to leave the project for doing something else, we actually could turn to the spatial analysis. And that meant that we were looking for patterns of the evolution and the spread of the locations of these performances throughout these 2 cities, but also were able to look how they were related to the socio-economic structures of the neighborhoods they were given in, and the possible audiences that were targeted. And we could also interlink them to other cultural industry sectors as cinema and so on. But the results are to be found pretty soon in the PhD of Margo, of course.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As Ilja said, my name is Kristof Loockx, and I was involved in this project as a postdoctoral researcher. And the goal of my research was basically investigate the speakers in this lecture circuit from a social perspective. Now I have to stress that this was not possible without the wonderful database that Margo created, and at a later stage the work of Jason as well, which actually highlights that the work of the Center for Urban History was a real team effort. So what I actually did was I took a random sample of speakers. So I had 350 unique individuals, both men and women, and for both periods, 2 sample periods, and for both cities, Antwerp and Brussels. And then I started to collect data on these people, which is of course a very time-consuming task, but I'm used to that. So I used newspapers, biographies, secondary literature, civil status records, and so on. And this provided a lot of data, which resulted in a new database with biographical data on these people. So were they married or not, how old were they, and so on. And also all this information about backgrounds, socially, geographically, and so on. And based on the occupations, it was also possible to make a social stratification of those people. Now, in the end, it proves that the lecture circuit was actually a quite small world, actually. especially those people came from the middle classes and the elites, and they knew each other often. And then in the next stage, it was also possible to link this kind of data to, for instance, the organizations that invited those people and so on, which allows us to make a social analysis of these people, both socially and spatially, actually. Now, there are a number of publications forthcoming, so but the best thing is to read the dissertation of Margo. She's a very talented researcher, and this will be a perfect summary of the work of the Urban History Center. Thank you.
Since 1750. Oh, you have it here.
Hello. It's already there. So our research was, well, I call it here, how the optical lantern transformed education. So the practicalities of schooling have often proven to be very resistant to change. Not a lot of things changed throughout the ages. But nevertheless, during the first decades of the 20th century, many Belgian teachers did introduce a very new and different medium into their education, namely the magic, or how, as they called it, the optical lantern. So this apparatus was first used in Belgian schools during the 1880s and continued to be used in schools until well into the 1940s. By then, it was largely replaced by other media, like film and 35mm slides, which were, in fact, in many ways, modernized versions of the same medium. The practice to project images, films, and PowerPoint presentations on a screen, now commonplace and conceived of as a very self-evident part of schooling, originates in the educational use of the optical lantern in the early 20th century. So during the past 3.5 years, the KU Leuven team of BMagic focused on how the optical lantern and other projection media deeply transformed Belgian education in the late 19th and early 20th century, triggering changes that would have an impact on teaching practices up until today. Supervised by Professor Kaat Wils, who sadly cannot be here today, our team conducted research into the introduction and use of the optical lantern in primary and secondary schools on the one hand. That was mostly my part of the research, although we also did a lot together, and on its place in the broader intermediate landscape. So its links with other visual media used in schools, such as film fix, episcope projection, and educational film, on the other hand, and that's what Nelleke will say more about later. So the title of my PhD project is Teaching by Means of Light, the Optical Lantern in Belgian Schools between 1880 and 1940. And it will provide the first comprehensive analysis of the introduction and use of the optical lantern in primary and secondary education in Belgium. So in this thesis, I firstly focus on the introduction of the optical lantern into Belgian schools and the pedagogical debates surrounding it. Because when we started our project, we didn't know, or it was completely unknown, how and when the medium was first used in Belgian schools. So Nelleke and I spent a large part of our first year buried in the basement of the KU Leuven Educational Library, where they keep the old educational journals that no one ever needs, except for us. So we were just paging through hundreds and hundreds of issues of teachers and pedagogical journals, as well as government reports, just to find out more about the timeline of the introduction of the optical lantern. And we concluded that in Belgium, a first government attempt to introduce the medium into schools in secondary schools occurred in the early 1880s, but as a result of ideological struggle between the liberals and the Catholics, the project was abandoned. So most of the distributed lanterns, according to some who were writing at the time, ended up gathering dust in the cupboards of physics classrooms. But around 1895, a number of teachers started advocating educational lantern use again. And after a few years, they managed to get the government on their side, and that started to provide subsidies for schools to buy lanterns. And then in the early 20th century, the lantern was more broadly introduced. So by the 1920s and 1930s, many city schools as well as prosperous countryside schools had a projection lantern at their disposal. So in my dissertation, I also pay attention to the way in which slides were distributed to schools, because it turned out that, in fact, the slides were expensive, and as a result, teachers often had to make use of slides provided by lending services, like libraries. And as you might know, Belgium was a pillarized society in which liberals and Catholics lived largely separated lives while battling each other in politics, but also very fiercely in education. So these slide lending services were also pillarized institutions. And as a result, the catalogs of Catholic, liberal, and supposedly neutral public lending services show important ideological differences. When it came to topics like, just as a funny example, dinosaurs, to get back to Kurt's research, I found these slides of dinosaurs mentioned in the Catholic lending service of Antwerp, of which you see the emblem here. And I thought, why are they using these? Because it's not very biblical. And it turned out I found out the text that they probably used for the lecture. And the conclusion of the text was, these dinosaurs are so complex, they cannot have appeared just by evolution. They have to have been created by God as well. But there was one subject on which all slide lending services were very similar, and that is the country of Belgium. So that shows how important the medium was in the dissemination and the creation of an idea of what Belgium looked like in a time when most people did not travel a lot. Educational slides were often produced by teachers themselves. That has to do with the fact that, contrary to larger countries like the UK or France, Belgium did not have a very big industry of slide producers. So teachers often just had to make do with the slides that they could buy abroad or make themselves. So they often complained that the slides that they could buy were not portraying the subjects that they wanted to show in a way that they thought suitable for their classes. And we discovered that as a result, they often started producing their own slides and combining slides with each other from various sets. The secondary school teacher Véron de Dijne, for instance, he even started selling large numbers of the slides that he produced to his colleagues. And as a side note, I think that he even provided slides of, for instance, the production of iron and steel to Paris French publishing houses Mazot and Radiguet et Massiot. So if anyone knows more about how these publishers got their slides, and if there's more archival material about it, please let me know. And in their turn, the teachers who bought these slides then combined them, so they could buy slides produced by teachers like Véron de Dijne, but then they combined them with slides that they made themselves. And I think that this flexibility of the medium made it very attractive to teachers because they could photograph pictures or postcards that they thought suitable, or draw slides themselves, and show the topic of the lesson in a way that they thought was suitable for their pupils. And they could also easily adapt the medium to their ideological worldviews, which was very important in a time of ideological struggle and school war. That's what they call it. There was a school war between the Catholics and the liberals. So, except for this very practical aspect of the technology, the optical lantern also had another trait that was very attractive to teachers, namely the fact that it projected illuminated images onto a screen in a darkened room. My analysis of teachers' writings on educational lantern use and a number of school slide collections brought to light that in the eyes of a lot of Belgian teachers, the optical lantern offered many advantages over other teaching aids. Because, for example, it enabled them to show wonderfully colored images like this one in a darkened room, which supposedly helped to capture the attention of the pupils. Because it's in a dark room, you literally take away all other visual distractions. There's only one thing to look at, which literally beams into the minds of the pupils. And it could be used as a window into the world, like a way to travel to, for instance, a factory, while the actual school trip would be way more complicated to organize. And thirdly, teachers also used the unprecedented wealth of images that they could show on this big screen to show their pupils very complex phenomena, like volcanism or the production of steel and iron from all angles, like literally from all angles, because you could provide your class with such a large amount of images. And the last argument for the use of the lantern that I found was the fact that the images that were projected were very visible. Contrary to smaller images, these projections could be seen by all pupils at the same time, which was very useful when a teacher wanted to analyze an image with the entire class at the same time. So all in all, in the eyes of Belgian teachers, the optical lantern was a very useful medium that helped their pupils engage with the world around them in a very powerful way. Apparently, it was so attractive that now, more than 100 years later, I am still using a very similar technique in the same setting today. So that's how influential it was. But of course, it didn't work in isolation, but in an intermediate context, and that's what Nelleke is going to say more about.
Hello everyone, I'm Nelleke Teughels. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the KU Leuven branch of B-Magic. I study, as Wouter said, the intermediate relationships between various types of light projection, like magic lantern projection, but also film and film fix and episcope projection, used in Belgian classrooms in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. And for our brand new B-Magic book, Faith in a Beam of Light, which is part of the Media Performance History series, which we'll talk about later, I investigated the relationships between magic lantern projection, film and film fix, as they were used by Catholic organizations for religious education inside and outside schools. Now, film fix is a spooled roll of 35mm positive film on which 20 to 50 images are reproduced back-to-back in sequential order. And these images, like lantern slides, were supposed to be projected one by one on a large screen, with the lecturer providing the necessary commentary. Now, from its first appearance in the early 1920s, Catholics were quick to embrace the opportunities offered by this medium. At the time, the Church was trying hard to maintain its influence in Belgian society as it saw its position threatened by a growing number of secular organizations, spreading their so-called corrupting messages using illustrated lectures and, of course, also motion pictures. And in answer to this threat, Catholics searched for the best visual pedagogical tool that would allow Catholic educators and organizations to maintain a moral control over image consumption and also to strengthen, again, the Catholic influence in society. And FilmFix appeared to be exactly what they were looking for. The visual narratives could easily be modified or manipulated by altering the accompanying text, by on-demand production of FilmFix, or even by cutting and adding images. Moreover, the use of FilmFix was deemed more educational and pedagogical than the use of movies or magic lantern projection, which were portrayed by Catholics, but also by FilmFix producers, of course, as being stained by their recreational uses and also by the darkened rooms they required and which weren't necessary for FilmFix production. Now, this comparison of dispositives and the materiality of these FilmFix projectors also led me to my second current research strand, which again ties in with what Wouter is doing. And this is the materiality of educational technology and how this materiality was connected to changing views on educational purposes and the various ways that this materiality also necessitated changes to the spaces of education themselves, to the school infrastructure. And in our second book of the Media Performance History series, entitled Teaching with Light and Shadows, which will appear this summer, I trace the impact of the physical transformation of the classroom, like installing a projection screen, blackout curtains, a projection stand, electricity, or even the construction of a designated room for light projection, which were all needed to accommodate lantern projection in schools. And in doing so, I wanted to elaborate some of the imbrications between projection equipment, school infrastructure, pedagogical considerations, government policy, and also teachers' agency, which all influenced the educational use of optical lantern projection in Belgian education. And as it turns out, teachers, in fact, were the driving force behind the spread of the use of lantern projection, especially in municipal schools. Rather than passively following government instructions, they often took the initiative to try and facilitate and promulgate lantern use in schools. And they actively searched, as Wouter already said, for alternative ways to reach this goal when challenged by the inadequate, inert nature of school infrastructure and also budgetary constrictions that, it seems, were the real factors responsible for the rather slow-paced incorporation of projection technology into Belgian education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have two groups, two teams from the University of Brussels, the ULB, Université Libre de Bruxelles. And the first one up is CiASp.
Something went wrong. Something went wrong with our PowerPoints. Yeah.
Let's start.
Hmm? Yeah, the bullet points, you see. Otherwise, I sent another version. I don't know how they...
It's not the right format for...
Hmm?
You didn't send a PDF.
I did send a PDF. No, it's a PDF file, so... Otherwise... Yeah?
Go on.
And maybe
Yeah.
we can check.
Yes, we can check. We'd rather have the right presentation. No, these are okay. The
Just the first two.
yes, but it's important.
But is that really the same?
This one is not right, and the second one.
If it's important, let's try to switch to the right presentation, and we'll have the other ULB team smoothly
first, then. All right. And I will send a...
You haven't seen it yet.
Ours is just Time New Roman and white. So. Yeah, is it? Oh. Yeah, okay. Hello. Yeah. So we're part also of we're the second ULB team, people working in the field of theater studies. The acronym has been changed. We're now also part of the same research group, but that doesn't matter. Our work package was about transnational perspectives, so the link between the use of the magic lantern in Belgium and other countries or continents with a double focus. On the one hand, the circulation of knowledge, materials and representation between Belgium and other countries, so the mobility of actors and artifacts. And then on the other hand, the lantern as a communication tool in relation to the Belgian colonization project. And so this is the composition of our staff team. Like in football, we had some reshuffling. I'm very happy to see that Marta is here, to whom we owe a lot for the research in this project. And so Marta van Hassel worked with us until the beginning of this year, and then Anse became part of our team, and she will present her research, and it's important for you to know that she just started, and so she's inviting you also. It's a different kind of invitation towards you. And then Nele, who was in our team until January of this year, and then she got an ERC, and my university was stupid enough not to make her a good offer. And so I lost her. But we're still working together. And then there's me. I became very good in signing invoices for digitization projects. We also secured, but Sabine will talk about it, Dominique, I and Sabine also secured additional funding within the ULB for the digitization, which sort of intensified the process. And then a couple of side tracks developed, for example, the intertwinement with other forms of culture, entertainment, for example, circus, sideshows, etc. So much work has been done by Marta and Nele, and much work still needs to be done by Anse and also by me, which will, among other things, imply an edited volume together with Nele. As far as the research performs, so Marta invested a lot of time and energy together with her colleagues in making an inventory of colonial slides. We have knowledge of about 20,000 colonial slides in 15 different collections, while Nele from her side focused on the circulation of slides and artifacts. And what became very quickly clear is that there is this very complex intertwinement or interference between colonial discourse on the one hand and scientific or pseudo-scientific discourse on the other hand. We analyzed how Lantern Lectures functions as a sort of platform for Belgian religious, scientific and colonial societies from the late 19th century onwards. And in fact, these colonial slides offer a very interesting perspective on a particular part of the Belgian elite culture, where you had a strange mix of philanthropy on the one hand, scientific curiosity on the other hand, and geopolitical imperialism on the other. And that's the mix that is of interest to us. Marta, and this is part of the work that will be taken over by Anse. Marta worked mainly on three corpora. On the one hand, the collection of lantern slides about the scientific expedition to the Ruwenzori Mountains, and me myself, and I know. I was thinking about a song. Nele, Marta, and I will finalize this in the form of an article. Marta also worked on the lantern lectures of the West Flemish priest Joseph Napoleon Flamer, and Marta is, as we speak, finalizing an article. And then quite an amount of work has been done on the lantern lectures of the KAGA, the Royal Geographical Society, and this part is moving to answer. In our research, we combine different types of archival resources, slides, but also letters, diaries, travelogues, and theoretical literature. And the more we advanced, the more it became clear that emotions and rhetoric are crucial, networks are crucial, and that our corpora are characterized by the intertwinement, the very complex intertwinement of different kinds of discourse and different kinds of visual representation. And I think it's what we call in media studies a kind of convergence culture in which you see representations migrate from one platform to the other. It's something we saw also today. But I think the most important lesson, as far as I'm concerned, Marta brought on in his project is that it's important also to focus on what is not performed by colonial archives, and so on the gaps and what I would call the glitches in the systems of knowledge, and propaganda. That's, I think, a major methodological concern in our project. Nele?
So, as Karel already mentioned, we worked on, or our focus was a transnational, or we had a transnational perspective. That's what also our projects connect. In my own personal, were sold internationally and passed on across several generations, but also borders by itinerant show people and lecturers. Here we are, but I wanted to start with the first. Yeah. So in the beginning of the project, I did with Jason, you already saw him, we performed a pilot study in 2 phases to map transnational itineraries of a few traveling lanternists based on very extensive archival research I did in municipal archives of Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels, and Liège, combined with a newspaper service, and this already learned or gave an idea of the geographical scope of their itineraries. And from this survey, we also learned that many traveling lanternists performed at annual fairs in provincial towns, and also that the established itinerant fairground theatres or itinerant theatres often integrated the lantern into their shows and regularly also bought and appropriated images from neighboring countries. So this project raised questions about the role of these itinerant show people in the transnational circulation of knowledge, technology, and visual culture. So this research has surfaced how the 19th century fairground functioned as a platform for cultural transfer and the dynamic interplay of different cultures and languages, because indeed itinerant show people transgressed not only national but also linguistic boundaries, spatial boundaries, but also artistic boundaries, and combined often different roles such as or roles and activities such as artists, but also multilingual entrepreneur, one could say, and they also lived as migrants or as mobile people, traveling people. So as such, they were cultural mediators, circulating, adapting, translating, and transforming the meaning of the objects and technologies they appropriated. The cases I worked on, or we worked on, revealed actually how the magic lantern, or the agency of the magic lantern, as a medium for transferring visual culture and knowledge to ordinary people, or even people from all different classes. So indeed, not only bourgeois cultures, but also at the fairground to other classes, the lower classes, one could say. And then sparked by these observations, and many of you who are here today were there in Brussels as well, sparked by these observations, we organized also with the ULB team an international symposium on the magic lantern and the fairground. So the question of what what kind of place the Magic Lantern had. That was in 2019 in Brussels, also in the Cinémathèque. Hilde de Labie was also partner in the organization, where we discussed the first result with peers, and that was also actually the basis for me to lay the foundations of an this the ERC grant Carol already mentioned, the one I submitted in 2020, and that was awarded 1 year later. I'm not going to discuss it in detail right now. That is for the future project panel on Saturday, but this gives me already the chance to mention it. The basic question of this project is how scientific knowledge, knowledge cultures, new technologies and visual culture circulated through science performance and exhibits at the 19th century fair, 19th, early 20th century, and how these shows were produced, performed and received by local audiences. More on that later in this week. And the final thing I want to mention is that some of you might recognize Julie Courtois. Some of you, people who know me know that this is one of the cases I've been working on a lot, not only because she was a good example of a female lanternist, and that is one of my side projects also, the role of women in fairground communities, or the role of women, female lanternists, and by extension, the many invisible hands of lanternists who are often or who remain often unseen because of their role in the wings of a theater. So I'm very happy now to give the floor to Anse, our most recent and youngest member of the MuMagic team. So please, Anse, here you are. Okay. Oh. That's normally the same presentation. Just the next slide in the same presentation.
Now you see why we chose to go around those
Yeah, wait, I'll quickly. Yeah.
Or we're not that better.
We're losing part of the title, but Anse will help you around.
Okay.
Next time we need to use these animations that jump.
Yeah. So my name is Anse de Weert, and even though we are at the final conference of BMagic, I have only just started my research. So this also means that a lot of you are the real experts here. So you're very, very welcome to come find me afterwards to share with me your thoughts. I will try to uncover the role of colonial lantern slides in Belgium. And in doing so, I will also touch upon the entanglements between scientific and geographic communities and state officials and also missionaries and their entanglements and also their interests and their entangled interests. Okay, so what I will do is map the Belgian lectures, the colonial lantern lectures, in which these colonial lantern slides were used. Then also map the circulation of these images and also following some of the public speakers on their journeys. And that's also why I chose in my title, you can see the title, Traveling Colonial Pictures. Because, first these images traveled to Belgium and then traveled around in Belgium and even beyond. Yes, and then I also want to reflect on the colonial heritage because of the institutions like archives and universities I will come across in my research. And I will also try to make these slides accessible for others. And then, of course, I also want to reflect on the impact of these colonial lantern, of the representations in these colonial lantern slides on today, because it's of incredible importance for contemporary debates on racism and decolonization. Marthe had already discovered and identified a lot of lantern slides in Belgium, so it was really easy for me to see what is available. And I have now started to look at the Geographical Society of Antwerp and their lantern slides. And I have identified two really interesting cases of two public speakers that traveled around. I want to tell you all about it, but I don't think I have enough time. And I want to investigate this case of the Geographical Society to have an idea about these scientific and geographical circles and also their economical interests. And a second case is the Colonial University of Belgium, because I also want to cover the lantern lectures of state officials. Also, I have chosen to work on the Institute of Tropical Medicine of Antwerp to have some of a more medical perspective. Also, the slides that you can see here are from the Tropical Institute. Then we also have the University of Brussels to also have the academic circles involved. And I also have CADOC, the Documentation and Research Center for Religion, Culture and Society. So I hope to find there some interesting cases of missionary lantern slides. Now I talked about some circles, some scientific circles, then about missionaries, but I also hope to find a lot about their entanglements and how they moved to each other's circles. So I hope that I also can tell you something about Belgium's upper class, while at the same time it of course goes far beyond the upper class because it's about information that is being spread to a wider public. So yeah, that's briefly what I want to do in the next years. I will be at my poster that is in the hallway this Saturday during lunchtime, but you also know how I look now, so you can always come talk to me if you have any thoughts. Okay, thank you.
So I think the right presentation will be up in a minute, but I suggest that upper right angle of the image you see dinosaurs. The same dinosaurs that I showed you that were drawn by Evelien for Figuier and used for Jules Verne, so they took on a very iconic shape and returned for like 70 years afterwards in different kinds of books and posters like this one.
They were also copied by the Catholics in a different form.
And we also found that the lantern was a very crucial device in somehow uniting the idea of the Catholics on prehistory with the scientific idea of prehistory. So they really managed somehow through what the French called concordism to create one coherence.
Okay. It's quite melodramatic, so. Okay, so you can see the names of our team there. So as a follow-up of my past and ongoing research and publication output on the subject of the melodramatic mode and the aesthetics of rhetorical audiovisual figures in early European cinema, I have opted with Bart Moons in the framework of the present EOS research program for an extension of an analytic paradigm that may apply to the magic lantern as a cultural medium. The melodramatic mode of expression, as posited by Christine Gledhill in her seminal book Melodrama Unbound, is a mode of aesthetic articulation distilled from an adaptable across a range of genres, decades, and national cultures. So this was a bit our point of departure. We have tried to cover 3 main points. So, of course, archival research, because we realized that extensive archival research in many Belgian and European archives, as you can see, listed Caddo, Kawel, Leuven, Mundaneum, private collection, archives of the Augustinians of the Assumption in Paris. Bart went to Rome, the CNC, BNF. We tried to cover it as much as we could. Was essential to allow us the feasibility of our initial hypothesis.
Yes, so a cornerstone of our approach is this to turn to the surviving sources, where the melodramatic mode of expression was a criterion to select our corpus of slides and text. It soon became evident that in order to fully grasp the lantern medium on the one side and the melodramatic mode of expression on the other, it was necessary to find out how these images, these lantern slides, came about and how they interrelated with other media. And through our media archaeological approach, with a focus on the material features and techniques to produce lantern slides, we gained, in fact, essential insights in the creation processes in order to explore the aesthetic qualities to the fullest. And a primary and important example for our research and an example of our approach is the material analysis I executed of the photomontage techniques that were used by the French Catholic editor, Maison de la Bonne Presse, it was already mentioned this morning, to create their extraordinary live model slides. In this type of live model slides, the backgrounds were painted by an artist. This is an example, in fact it's a detail of such a slide. The backgrounds that you see, the walls, the leaves, they are painted by an artist, while the characters were all photographed separately or in group positionings. And then running through a series of stages of extensive photo collage and retouching, the retouching was also very important in the process, these images were produced to create attractive but yet pious images. And this slide is a nice representation of such an image.
So our third point is somehow focusing on emotion vectors, and we try to investigate the melodramatic mode of expression with a lantern in concrete cultural practices in Belgium from a perspective of the history of emotions. So emotions are explained as complex construction, and melodrama became a means of exploring specific cultural conceptualizations and deployments of emotions, as we will see in the next examples. Yep.
So after the first surveys in different Belgian archives executed during the first months and the first year of the BMagic project, it soon became clear that temperance propaganda was highly representative for melodramatic expression in lantern culture. And hence it became a crucial, important case study in our research. This is already described for the British context quite extensively by researchers such as Karen Eifler, Richard Krangle, Ludwig Vögel-Bienek, who are present among us. But, however, this is anything but the case for the Belgian situation, where the lantern was not yet recognized by cultural historians as a medium for anti-alcohol propaganda. Thus, for the very first time, we've placed the lantern for anti-alcohol propaganda in a historical and intermedial perspective. Furthermore, we analyze the strategies of this type of propaganda in the light of this melodramatic mode of expression, and mainly in its emotional communication to persuade audiences. And those who were present at yesterday's Magic Lantern show had a nice example of such a melodramatic anti-alcohol series, also a film, and they could experience and witness the emotional charge of these images and texts. And we've also demonstrated it in our, as Dominique and I, in our essay for the recent book, Faith in a Beam of Light. And here on this slide, the image in the middle, this is a lantern slide. It's in fact part of a series, and it's in fact one of the few slide sets of Belgian origin that have been reproduced on a fairly large scale. And in this case, it was they were made by a temperance union. But it's also an important illustration of our approach throughout our research. With an emphasis, we have a strong emphasis on the intermediality of the medium. And these images in particular, they were also published in the newspapers of anti-alcohol associations.
So, next slide. So, as a consequence of our extensive archival research of life model slides in Belgian and French collection, our most important assessment to date is proving the multimodal impact of lantern slide and film production by Maison de la Bonne Presse in Belgium, France, and worldwide. We've seen the Canadian example yesterday with Germain's presentation and in yesterday's performance, of course. So the images you can see in the background of the PowerPoint are from the Belgian set of slides from Cadoc and Bundaneum. Saint Tarcisius in the background, you have the Passion of the Christ, and Noël de la Petite Aveugle. You've extensively watched yesterday the film and the set of slides. And so these are corresponding films we watched at the CNC in Bois d'Arcy. So Saint Tarcisius, the Passion, and Noël de la Petite Aveugle, we identified the set of slides and the corresponding films. So we discovered that different medias and techniques achieved very specific emotional dynamics through shared practices and techniques, acting style, set designs, lecture scripts. We identified music scores, coloring techniques proper to the life model slide production and to early films by Maison de la Bonne Presse and its creative director, Honoré Le Sablé. So we find lots of them. Here you have just some examples. We also watched some of them in the BNF. They are not exactly in film condition, so sometimes you can even find them on YouTube for La Légende de Saint Bernadette, for example. But the very, very important detail is that most of them are very complete in terms of set of slides. You could see yesterday, Noël de la Petite Aveugle has not been preserved completely, but the set of slides are complete, so this allows us to have an extensive analysis. So we hope to have demonstrated this through yesterday's Magic Lantern and early film performance. Thank you.
So now to something totally different. I talk about the optical lantern as a didactic tool in spiritual societies and at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And I have 2 slides, and thank you, Bart, for having done the 3 slides. Bravo. As I said, for the UA, it's or the University of Antwerp, it's very important that you know on what you work. So I did, as Cara already mentioned, an inventory. This time it was not mapping, it was really an inventory, and thanks to the Fonds d'encouragement à la recherche, we got the money to do so, and the idea was to make the slides in our own archive at ULB, to preserve them, to make them accessible, and so that we can do research, and not only we, but other researchers as well, because what you see here, these are the worst cases you can imagine. They were they came in the 1960s, and they were not treated. They were left in a corner or in several corners. So we're together with the archive. The slides were reassembled in one room, and thanks to the money, we could clean a lot of them, because this is just awful, and put them into a good, correct preservation state. The project took about 2 years. Now it's over. The glass plates in our university archive, we have about 19,000, which is a lot. There are positives and negatives, I guess, because I couldn't do the archive until the end, because I did 60% and then came COVID. And this was the end of the inventory. I would have loved to do the rest, but there was no time. So now, thanks to the financial support by our university, we had about 3,000 slides that were preserved. And thanks to Iguana, but I talk about this tomorrow, thanks to the collaboration with a company, a professional company, now we have access to 3,400 slides, because we did recto verso, because there's always some information, interesting information on the back. When we had this, then we asked them, what did we do? There are several interesting slide collections. The sociologue, the professor of sociology, Emil Waxweiler, we did 100%. So it's a highly interesting collection for everybody who wants to study the significance of sociology when Waxweiler was working. Then, according to what you count, or the total slide masses that was inventoried, we did 16% or 9% of the total slides we have at ULB. This is the professor of biology, Jean Massard, and his colleagues, which have collected their own made slides, which are in the collection. And what I don't want to forget is Leon Ruppe. You see here behind a fantastic one slide, which means there was not a double protection slide, as a double protection glass, but it's just drawn in color on a glass plate. So we did this as well, 120 slides. And the Ruwenzori, which was already mentioned, was done photographically by Bart and by Marta. So we have some more slides here. And what I don't want to miss is the related collection, which is not at ULB, but which is at a municipal archive in Brussels, Charles Wils. I will come back to him on my next slide, because now what I tell you is how I did my research. In principle, I started with the Freemasons. Okay, I had no idea what Freemasons do, so I studied Freemasons first, and then I thought, okay, I just look how they used it. Very difficult, because secret societies are secret. So what I could do is use the slides. They're symbolic, because the Freemasons use symbolics to teach. When they use slides, it's normally for mnemonic training. The slides have replaced the board, the symbol that you have to study when you want to get from one degree to this next one. So it was more obvious to teach them with slides. What I can say is that teaching in Belgian lodges is relatively early. Teaching with slides is much later. It's when mass production started, and it's an intellectual, spiritual exercise for fellows. This was more or less the end. It ended in a nice, hopefully you will read it, in a nice article on lantern slides and symbolic, compared with the Catholics. Then, I couldn't get more information, though I started finally with the ULB, which was then, after having been stopped by Corona, was then available a year later, so that I could start with analyzing the slides. And what I can see is there is a fantastic group of professors, and I just mention some. It's Leo Herrera, Paul Léger, Jean Massard, Charles Baumer. They were all teachers, professors at ULB, and they're a part of something which is called la cité scientifique. Non, c'est scientifique. Oui, I always said Cité des Sciences, but it's Cité Scientifique, how they called it in their own writing. So it's from the 1890s to the 1920s, then they moved to other parts of Brussels. And it's really interesting because we can trace the relations back not only to England, whereas the BAAS, the British Association for the Advancements for Science, but also to the Ligue de l'Enseignement, where Charles Wils had the crucial role because he discovered this teaching in the Netherlands, brought it to Belgium, started his own league, and then the French league with Jean Massé came. So it's a very early thing. Okay, extension Universitaire Libre. The professors taught a lot to a mass audience, not a specialized audience. Introduction into university started later, and they used it for research because this is what becomes obvious when you go through the slides in this collection. Thank you very much.
From the Université, Université Leuven. The presentation will be up in a minute.
Okay. Okay. So we are waiting for the slide, the ghost slide. Thank you, Kurt, to be there. So it's so fine to be here with all the teams after COVID. So, hello everybody. I'm Philippe Marion, principal investigator of the UCL teams. Everyone will introduce himself, but I would like to mention Natalia Maisova, who was our first postdoc. I think she is in the somewhere. It was a great memory to work with her. I would like to fix our project, our mission in three perspectives, three main perspectives. The first one is the narrative question. So the narrativity of lantern slide, but only the lantern slide. We also work on the narrativity of the device support, and also the narrative in the projection and the performance of the operator. I think it's an interrelation between all these poles to create narrative, to create narrative effect. So it's I think it's a principal main objective of our team, donc the narrativity. And also the narrative questions took a new dimension with the exploration of panoramic slides. We discover a lot about this, and multifocal lanterns. The second perspective is the materiality, the graphic material of the image, and is possible reworking, reshaping, according to the projection effect. And the third perspective is the focus, like a lot of people here, the focus of intermediality, studying how the images of lantern slide travel through other media and cultural practices. But also, all the already existing images are remediated by the lantern. As you can see here with the sample, with this illustration, is an original series from Willenbusch, and its remediation in lantern slide set, and also in lantern live model. So it's the kind of subject that I am working on personally. the circulation of this kind of images. So I give the floor to our PhD. We can applaud.
No. Okay. So I am Evelien Jonckheere, and as the PhD student of the UC Leuven team, I have been working for almost 4 years now to achieve my dissertation called The Magic Lantern for Children, Attractive Toy or Narrative Media, and I am currently in the writing process of the thesis. So my research focuses on the toy magic lanterns, their slides and their use in the family sphere as an extension of the use of other lanterns in the public sphere. I structured my work around 3 main approaches related to the 3 perspectives of our team project, but of course reinterpreted in my own way. The first concerns the materiality of lanterns and slides. In this part, I do not study the projections, but the objects themselves by looking in particular at the editorial strategies and principles of collection established by the producers and at the attractiveness of the slides and lanterns. Yes, I also have to mention that in that part, this is not only the lanterns and slides that I'm focusing on, but in my corpus, I also have catalogs, and I'm also looking at other objects such as posters of the boxes of the lanterns. Yes, the second approach focuses on the narrativity of the slide projection, and in order to study narrativity, I work gradually by focusing in turn on the meeting between narrative and slide alone, between narrative and visual projection, and between narrative and lantern shows by taking into account other variables such as the presence of verbal elements. My third and final approach is an intermediate approach, and I aim to interrogate the encounter between the lantern and other media. So this is for my very brief resume of my thesis, but of course I am available to discuss it further with you during the breaks. But today we are also here to highlight our team work. From the beginning, my doctoral dissertation has been influenced by the research and discussion of the team, in particular with regard to a narratological approach. Inversely, my focus on toy lantern led us to work initially on a certain type of slide and to put forward the notion of sliding. It also seems to us that sliding was a key concept for understanding how anyone can construct narratives from the visual projection. In the context of this research, we have developed an application, as some of you may know, and this is what you are seeing in the PowerPoint slide. We have set up this application in collaboration with the MIL, a laboratory of the UC Leuven specialized in technological innovations. This application allows us to reproduce the passage of the sliding of the slides in front of the lens of the magic lantern. So although it remained a research tool, it was helpful to deepen our research on sliding and narration. But after the development of the application, it was necessary to expand our research and take into account other possibilities offered by the manipulation of the lantern, and for that I give the floor to Sébastien.
Hi everybody, I'm Sébastien Février, another principal investigator. Another achievement of our team is the direction of a special issue of the online journal Cahiers de narratologie, which has titled La lanterne magique comme dispositif narratif, the magic lantern as narrative apparatus. This issue will be published in July or September 22. It will include 6 articles, including a great interview with a professional lanternist, and Gourdes-Marais. For UC Louvain team, this project was very important because it brings together an important part of our research. There are actually few studies on the narrative stakes of the lantern, and particularly from a narratological point of view. So there was an urgent need to deal with the narrative question asked by the lantern, knowing that narratological approaches have evolved considerably from the mid-19th to such an extent that we now speak of new narratologies or post-narratologies to designate narrative approaches that are performative and contextualist. Therefore, the aim of the issue is not so much to study the structure of the stories projected by the lantern, but to understand more fundamentally what the lantern do in terms of narrative, with what kind of technological devices, and in what specific context. At this point, the temptation will be great to spoil the content of the article, but I will content myself with identifying 3 research directions around which the contributions are articulated. A first direction is that of the narrative effects produced by the slide. Some articles pay attention to the diversity of the formats, for instance, the panoramic plates, and to the arrangement of figurative motifs on the plate. These studies outline the role of projection, which acts like a light cutting, un découpage lumineux, by accentuating or diminishing the narrative feature present on the slide. A second main line concerns the technical and expressive gesture that allows the lanternist to produce, or not, a story. This topic is obviously linked to the technological aspect of the devices, the difference, for instance, between a double or a simple lantern. And among the different gestures, attention is paid in particular to the gesture of sliding and the gesture of dissolving, which do not necessarily have the same narrative implication, notably in terms of sequentiality. A third research direction explores the context in which the narrative conveyed by the lantern circulate. This context should be considered as an environment where the projected stories meet and configure the social, scientific, and religious concern of the time while participating in their dissemination. And this cultural context is, of course, a media context, and many contributions show the relationships between, for instance, the lantern and other media, such as diorama or photography. This is the menu of this issue, and we hope that it will be of interest to a large number of people, both lantern specialists, but also narrative specialists, because it seems to us that this issue allows us to draw wider lessons concerning narration by fixed image at the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you.
I give the floor to Céline Weaver, our PhD.
No,
our
postdoc.
Sorry, sir.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm going to be actually very brief because I had a presentation already yesterday for those who were in Brussels yesterday. I made a presentation on the use of color in the slides made by some Belgian photographer like Gustave Maricio, the use and the effect of color, why the color was used in a certain type of way, and also my research was kind of joining also Bartmont's research. So I'm not showing it today. And my research on color brought me actually to chromolithography, which was a method of pressing, like a lithography color on different formats. It started with paper, then it went to slides. Most of the slides that Adeline showed were actually chromolithography, not all of them, but some of them. And chromolithography was also made on a loop. So that's why this is actually Philip's creation, from sliding to looping. This is where my research is going now. Sliding, why? Because so the movement of slide horizontal was, of course, the usual one on lantern toys. And then when the cinematograph of the brother Lumière's arrived, the lantern added a system of projecting chromolithography celluloid loops. But there were loops. That means you could repeat again and again the same scene. And this question of loop is quite interesting because it's actually a wide topic in pre-cinema, like the théâtre optique of Reynaud, which was also a loop system, an horizontal system, and the kinetoscope of Edison, which was the same repeated scene, but just for one user, one spectator. So we will talk about it tomorrow with Caroline Fournier, which is the head of the film collection of Cinémathèque Suisse. That's why I won't be very long about this topic now, but this is the future of my research. Thank you.
Thank you. Is going to talk about two projects, his participation in BMagic, Media History, University of Utrecht, and also a fellow project, Projecting Knowledge.
Yes, thank you. Well, normally we had planned things very differently because Klaas de Zwaan, who's the postdoc in the project, was supposed to give the main body of this presentation, but unfortunately he was forced to cancel on very short notice for family reasons, and that's why we also had to improvise this a bit more than we had thought in the beginning. But what you've probably seen from all these presentations that we've had in this carousel is that on the one hand, BMagic is a project that is very complementary. It's covering a very large terrain of different issues and questions. And at the same time, there's also a lot of points of contact between the different projects. And that's also the case for our project in Utrecht, which is called The Other Low Country. There was obviously a flattery to the Belgians, and it was a successful one in the end. So already in the title you can see that the transnational, by definition, is an important part here, but also through the Projecting Knowledge project, transmission of knowledge, and also the relationship with the Catholics has been very important in some of my work together with Sabine. We've been writing on the way in which in these conflicts about the souls of young people that took place here in Belgium, but also in France, how the Catholics developed strategies imitating or as they were afraid that they were losing terrain against the liberals, how they were building up networks, building up infrastructures in order to counter these ideological enemies, and Maison de Bonne Presse is one very important example here. So, which one is that? Right. So we very quickly, about 6 to 9 months after the start of BMagic, could start with a partner project, Projecting Knowledge, which is financed by the Dutch National Research Organization, and apart from the fact that we could refer in the application already to earlier Utrecht-led Magic Lantern project, 1 Million Pictures, and many of the people here have been participating in doing research for 1 Million Pictures or been participating in events organized by 1 Million Pictures. But also when I was interviewed at NWO in The Hague, the fact that I could say, well, this is the moment for you to finance this project because we have this gigantic partner project in Belgium, and we can create a lot of synergies. I hope that was well, in the end I got it, so it may have been a persuasive argument. So the members of Projecting Knowledge are present here. Dulce da Rocha Gonçalves, who's working on the way in which in society knowledge was transmitted through public lectures. You're looking at infrastructures, but also at the various activities in that terrain. Nico de Klerk, who's looking at the people who work both inside academia, but also were very present outside of academia by giving illustrated lectures. And Jamila is looking mainly at the way in which inside academia the lantern was introduced and how it functioned in different disciplines, because obviously the role of projected images varies from one discipline to the other, from the projection of just artworks for art history teaching to the use of so-called epistemic images in the sciences that were also used for proving certain theories, for instance. At my work in Projecting Knowledge is trying to synthesize all of what Nico, Jamila and Dulce are going to write in their works, but I also have been working together with Sabine on the, for instance, entry of the lantern in academia, and this is part of this is an article which is part of the book on teaching with light and shadows. You will hear more about. So let me now go say a lot more about the work that Klaas has been doing, because he was really doing the central work in our BMagic contribution, whereas I was moving more in the margins because of these double functions. And Klaas has taken as a main focus of his work the role of the lantern as a medium in early wars. And that will result in, among others, also in a special issue of Early Popular Visual Culture, which he is co-coordinating. And it's also linked to a joint effort with Evelien Jonckheere for a journal issue for a Dutch language historical journal, the Moderne Tijd, which is about social interactions by means of illustrated lectures and the lantern. So for Klaas, that was his central activity, and he's been working in particular on two cases. One is the use of the lantern during the Boer War. Now, the Boer War is obviously one of the really early media wars, modern media wars that has been fought. And interestingly, it's been also of great interest to film historians, because that is the war that was really using film for propaganda ends on a very, very large scale. But in the Netherlands, for instance, there's been also some kind of misperception of the media being used in that war, because the Dutch term Lichtbeelden has by some historians been interpreted as moving pictures, so early film, whereas in fact very often these were illustrated lectures. And obviously from both the Flemish side and the Dutch side, sympathies went to the Boers rather than to the British, and so there were many lecturers who traveled from Belgium to the Netherlands to talk about the Boer War and basically making propaganda for the Boer side in this war. The other big topic that Klaas has been working on is the First World War, and this is sort of also linked to his PhD project, which was on film propaganda during the First World War in the Netherlands. And now the situation in the Netherlands was quite exceptional in Europe in the First World War because it was a neutral country. So it was also the country where the different parties in the war tried to bring in their propaganda and gain sympathies by the Dutch population. And at the same time, the Netherlands were extremely careful to preserve their neutrality. So there were quite a number of government measures that tried to block too open sympathies for one side or the other side in the war. So Klaas found many instances where diplomats were complaining about screenings where people were cheering for the French, or in Pathé cinemas, of course, that was happening quite often. The magic lantern was also used very massively by the Belgians, and of course many Belgians had fled into the Netherlands once the invasion by the Germans had started, which means there was also a huge community of Belgians in the Netherlands who were trying to gain support for the Belgian cause. And one of the strategies that Klaas has been analyzing were lectures by art historians such as Leo van Pooijvelde, who was giving lectures on architecture in Belgium for Dutch and international audiences. And one of his strategies was to show images of, for instance, the big cathedrals like in Ypres, or the town hall, and then showing slides of how it looked at that time, destroyed by the German army. And so he could, under the guise of an art historical lecture, still contribute to the propaganda effort of the Belgians. And this is part of an article that Klaas has been writing and which hopefully will appear soon, as will his work on the Boer War. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Teughels is the last one in this carousel from Kask School of Arts.
One more. What a rich afternoon. Thank you, my apologies. I don't have anything to show. But thank you kindly, Kurt, for still allowing me, because there was a little misunderstanding. It was only about academic research, whereas you invited me initially on the project to be curating side projects or projects that bring another perspective to the contemporary culture of the Magic Lantern, because it's always from the present that we write history, and this is, I think, very much what is happening and has been demonstrated this afternoon, and throughout, obviously, the whole research period. Very few people, Sabine did, mentioned the C word, COVID, as a kind of annoying factor in doing things, particularly if you want to do things in public and for public. We all have experienced that. Let's not dwell on it. It started off rather, I think, promisingly with, in 2019, I did a project where I involved a colleague of mine from the Rotterdam Film Festival, Julian Ross, who came up with the idea, let's do a project on slides. So I will just give a brief recount of what has happened, what could happen, and what will still happen from my perspective. So Julian had this idea to do a show with contemporary artists using the carousel and all having made work post-2004. 2004 was the year where Kodak stopped the carousel. So we're at the end of the carousel here. A second very important argument for him was that I want to bring in, and this topic has been raised, luckily, works that bring a non-Western perspective to the practice of using the Coda carousel. So he brought in works from Belgium, from England, from Holland, but also from Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, India even. So that brought in really, really a different and very contemporary, although media archaeological, so deliberately anachronistic, one could say, use application by artists of this medium of the magic lantern. And that show happened in the slipstream of a conference in Brussels in 2019 at the location Grey Light Project. The show was called Blackout. Then the blackout or the COVID or the lockdown happened, and so doing other things in the context of a symposium was very difficult because it's not about a 2D projection, it's about experiencing visual art in space, curating, positioning it in space, or as Erki also demonstrated again very lively this afternoon, media archaeology is not just an academic discipline, it's actually quite often an undisciplined discipline, and it's something that you also need to practice and not only reflect upon. But then you have to be able to do it and allowed to do it. We did manage, so with a long interval, a project last autumn in Ghent in October 2021. A project that, I don't know how the title came about, or certainly it surfaced, it imposed itself. It was called Sur Place. And it was not about a lockdown, but it was playing with different notions of moving image, static image, what happens in between in that interval. And it became more of a B-Magic, as in a more Belgian project, because we had to avoid too many risks. And so let's work with artists that are allowed to travel, as in they are from Belgium or from Holland. So we from the big, very wide global scope of Blackout and the dozen artists there, kind of refrained myself to 7 artists, all Belgian or Dutch. Actually, one Dutch, which was maybe also the central point of the exhibition there. It was Steven Joersma, a Dutch guy living in Brussels, who reprised his piece Dia Exit, and it was an installation that he had to reconfigure, and it destroyed slides. It showed a slide. If you wanted to see the next slide, you could push a button, but then you knew you were destroying the slide you just saw. Kind of powerful piece, because of course there has been a huge amount of slide productions, and at the time Steven Joersma harvested the slides by compensating people with self-made apple cake. So there was another kind of important presence there in the exhibition was, and very Belgian, but I don't think many people outside Belgium know about this, is Tim Bruggeman, a graphic artist working from graphic design, but actually using lettering, publication. He's planning to make a film, it's still not finished, on this historical figure who passed away last November, Dr. Beaucourt, who was a real medic and somebody very famous for his emergency and international emergency help rescue efforts, but also who for 15 years, so between mid-90s and 2009, exposed over 1 million of secondary school children the effects of alcohol and weekend traffic. He had a kind of almost Ballard-like crash collection of slides of victims of weekend accidents. And so that's a kind of very influential figure in Belgian popular culture in a way. And Tim Bruggeman wants to revisit that legacy, the impact that it made, without exploiting the cruelty or the explicitness of the images. And he did that also by making almost panoramic description of all the slides with lettering on the windows. So the windows of the big gallery, the Zwarte Zaal in Ghent, became like monumental slides, one by one. We have a lot of glass panes there. And another, I think, very remarkable and somebody who's here, contribution to the exhibition there, Sur Place, is Hannes Verhoustraat, my colleague from KASK, who's a teacher in documentary filmmaking there, but also documentary filmmaker in his own right, who made his first installation. And the first installation he made was called Vue Brisée, and it's the same title of the film he's going to show this evening. Do come back at 7 o'clock to see a first screening and a first version of what is an ongoing project that we've spoke about it. I think we started like 3 years ago or longer. So it's been in gestation. It took a lot of different stages, and it's really getting there, but he's very, very eager to hear your feedback on Vue Brisée, so broken glass slides, but also breaking the conventions. I shouldn't interpret your film a priori. So it's a work in progress, but he's nearly there. He's very eager to hear your feedback or your comments on again, offering a very different and very contemporary, very playful, but also super serious perspective on the colonial tradition of the magic lantern slide practice. That was a big sketch. I mean, I was also part of the House of Mystery stint, projecting on smoke. We had fun with that. I wish I could have done more, but I think the film is probably the crowning on our efforts from our perspective. Thank you.